It was perhaps the most significant vote taken by any government this year, the moment that hundreds of millions of people across Ukraine, Europe, and America have been praying for. On Saturday, April the 20th, the US House of Representatives finally voted on 3 separate bills that would provide funding for US allies Ukraine, Israel, and Taiwan, as well as a 4th designed to force the sale of TikTok in the US. While all 4 bills were important in their own way, it was one on Ukraine aid that everyone was watching. The one that was set to determine whether 2024 would become the year Vladimir Putin won his brutal war of conquest. First proposed back in October as part of a mega package including the Israel and Taiwan bills, Ukraine aid had long been held up in Congress. Originally, Republicans had refused to pass the supplemental without Democrats agreeing to new enforcement measures at the US border. Crafting such a compromise bill took months, only for the GOP to tank it for not being strict enough. The Senate then passed the aid in full with an overwhelming majority, only for the Speaker of the House, Mike Johnson, to refuse a floor vote. Ukraine aid had therefore languished since February, seemingly another victim of America's partisan gridlock. But not anymore. Despite vowing to never advance the Ukraine bill without securing concessions on border enforcement, Speaker Johnson had an abrupt change of heart. According to reporting by the New York Times and AP News, he was swayed by intelligence reports that predicted Ukraine would lose by Christmas without the aid and that Putin would next attack NATO allies. In Speaker Johnson's own words, "I really do believe the intel. I think that Vladimir Putin would continue to march through Europe if he were allowed. I think he might go to the Baltics next. I think he might have a showdown with Poland." Added to this was likely the fact that the Speaker's own son is joining the Naval Academy this fall. To quote Johnson again, "This is a live fire exercise for me, as it is for so many American families. This is not a game. This is not a joke." Separately, he added, "To put it bluntly, I would rather send bullets to Ukraine than American boys." Whatever the cause of the Louisiana Republicans' road to Damascus moment, the results were the same. With backing of Democrats, Speaker Johnson managed to maneuver around his party's isolationist wing to get the bill out of committee and onto the floor for a vote. There, 311 voted in favor of Ukraine aid versus 112 against. And with that, the last major obstacle to unlocking over $60 billion for Kyiv to defend itself had fallen away. Ukraine-based Guardian journalist Luke Harding summed up the reaction in the trenches: "Palpable relief among outgunned Ukrainian troops on the front line and in Kyiv, the most important moment of the war in 2024. To be fair, it was a moment that came with some caveats. Despite left-wing Democrat opposition to sending aid to Israel, the Ukraine bill received by far the largest number of no votes. While a majority of House Republicans voted against the Ukraine bill, only 58 representatives voted against the Israel one, and a mere 34 against the Taiwan bill. Still, the vote sent a signal to Moscow, one which apparently annoyed Vladimir Putin. According to BBC Russia correspondent Steve Roseberg, Kremlin-backed newspapers have since denounced Speaker Mike Johnson as a brainwashed man with the look of a traitor. In short, it was a weekend of high drama, one which may well have forestalled a devastating victory later this year for Russian forces. But rather than relive the excitement or dig into the motivations of those involved, like Donald Trump, who chose not to urge House Republicans to tank the bill, we want to instead use this video to explore what the aid package is and what effect it might have on the war. And that's because one thing is certain. While a welcome relief for Kyiv and its allies, the $61 billion supplemental alone won't be enough to win the war. In fact, there are some who are worried that it has come too late to stave off even near-term disaster. That was the opinion of the Financial Times, which wrote that, quote, "The delivery of the US aid is unlikely to dramatically alter Kyiv's situation on the front line. That situation is what we in the business call dire. Since the eastern fortress town of Avdiivka fell to Putin's forces, the Ukrainians have been falling back, struggling to stop the Russians from making a major breakthrough. Whole villages have been lost. Key strategic towns like Chasiv Yar are under withering attack and may have fallen by the time you see this video. In some sectors, the Russian artillery advantage has reached an eye-watering 10-1. Lacking air defense interceptors, Kyiv has been forced to watch as the Kremlin's attack jets operate in the skies with near impunity. By some reckonings, this moment is the biggest threat Ukraine has faced since the conflict's opening days in early 2022. Frustratingly for Kyiv's supporters, this grim situation could have been avoided if only the House of Representatives had gotten its act together and voted a few months ago. Here's The Economist's defense editor, Shashank Joshi. Sad truth is that had a supplementary passed 6 months ago, Ukraine would have lost less ground, though it would still have lost some, inflicted greater casualties on Russia during that time, and incurred fewer of its own, both important in an attritional war. This feels doubly true when you realize that things don't magically change with Joe Biden signing the bill into law. While the Pentagon had positioned stocks in Germany ahead of the vote in order to ship them quickly to the Ukrainian border, getting new weapons and ammunition to frontline Ukrainian units at a large enough scale to make a difference will still take time. Former commander of the US Army in Europe, Ben Hodges, has said, quote, "It may be weeks before we see significant battlefield effects." For its part, the Institute for the Study of War predicts that Russia will step up attacks to take advantage of this short window and may make substantial gains before enough material arrives to stabilize the front. Among those new gains to the Kremlin may be Chasiv Yar, a city on a hill outside Bakhmut that acts as a key defensive point for Ukraine's forces. Analyst Rob Lee has suggested it might fall before help can arrive, a massive setback since taking control of it would allow Russia fire control over nearby strategic cities. Other gains may be expected in the Donbass. As we were writing this on Tuesday, social media was alive with news about the sudden Russian capture of Okharitin, a village 50 kilometers south of Chasiv Yar. By the time you see this, they may have advanced further still. For all the worries, though, there does seem to be a general assumption that the House passed this package in the nick of time. Per Reuters, the influx of weapons should improve Kiev's chances of averting a major Russian breakthrough. Of course, averting a major Russian breakthrough is not the same as winning the war. For all $61 billion may sound like a spectacularly large sum, no one thinks it is enough to do any more than, at best, keep Ukraine in the fight until the end of 2024. Speaking to the Financial Times, one anonymous Ukrainian official didn't even think it would help Kiev's forces hold the territory they have right now, saying the aid will help to slow down the Russian advance, but not stop it. So, if this gigantic spending bill is only going to prop up Ukraine in its fight for a few more months, you might reasonably ask, well, what's the point? And we'll circle around to answer that later in today's video. For now, though, we want to take a quick look at the key things the package will likely include and talk a little about why they're necessary. Perhaps the first, most crucial item: artillery. We mentioned earlier how Ukraine's artillery shortage has gotten so acute that Russia was firing 10 shells for every one that Kiev's forces fired. But even this doesn't reflect just how bad shell hunger on the front lines has become. In subsectors, The Guardian reports that, quote, "shortages were so acute that some Ukrainian gunners reported they were reduced to firing smoke shells to scare the Russians because they had no shells left," end quote. This deficit is partly due to the supplemental getting held up in Congress, but it's also due to the EU promising to manufacture and ship 1 million shells to Ukraine by this spring, and then falling short of that by a spectacular margin. As a result, even this latest influx of aid won't be enough to erase Russia's shell advantage. Analyst Rob Lee notes that after American shells arrive on the front lines, quoting, "Russia will still have an artillery advantage, it just won't be as great." Still, there's a huge difference between Russia having a 10-to-1 artillery advantage and Russia having a 3-to-1 or a 2-to-1 advantage. As things stand now, Russia can just slowly grind forward, blasting away and annihilating everything in its path. After the new shells, spare parts, and howitzers arrive, Ukraine should be able to arrest that advance. Here's analyst Franz-Stefan Gady writing on X: "Artillery ammo deliveries should soon be in place to support a defensive-oriented strategy for the next 12 months. In this, Kiev is likely to be further helped by a long-simmering Czech initiative to source shells from outside Europe. So far, 300,000 have been bought and paid for, while over 1 million in total are theoretically available if Prague can raise the cash. The first batch should arrive in Ukraine in June." So, that's a bit of good news. For all the delays, Kiev's forces should soon be packing enough artillery power to mount an active defense. The news is a bit more mixed. Where the next desperately needed item is concerned, though, air defense interceptors. The last couple of weeks have seen more intense Russian air bombardments than at any time in the war since November and December of 2022, when the Kremlin tried to knock out Ukraine's power grid and freeze the country into submission. In the wake of that failed campaign, Western countries supplied badly needed air defense, which worked across 2023 and even into the start of this year. But this spring, the situation deteriorated. Ukraine effectively ran out of interceptors, while Russia managed to destroy 2 Patriot batteries. The result has been Ukrainian skies that are nearly defenseless. Across the nation, cities have seen their utility grids shattered by bombing. Seemingly random Russian strikes on housing have killed hundreds of civilians. At the front, videos have emerged of attack jets flying over Chasiv Yar, unconcerned about retaliation from the ground. Thankfully, the next aid packet is almost certain to contain not only fresh interceptors for Patriots, but also man-made portable air defense systems, or MANPADS. Combined with Germany recently donating a fresh Patriot battery to Ukraine, this should help once again defend the nation's critical infrastructure. The bad news is that it won't be enough to close Ukraine's skies. Hell, it won't even be enough to stop Russian missiles from getting through and causing misery. The Economist explains that production of new Patriot systems is low, and that there are pressures from other embattled nations such as Israel that mean they can't all be shipped to Ukraine. Franz Stefan Gady assesses that it'll be months before enough air defense ammo and launchers can be built in America and shipped to Kyiv. In that time, as The Economist writes, quoting, "Too many missiles will get through, and too many Russian warplanes will fly too freely in Ukrainian skies." Another key capability likely to be included in the first package from the new supplemental will be something else Kyiv urgently needs: armored fighting vehicles. Right now, Ukraine does not have enough armored vehicles to adequately evacuate all its wounded troops. This leads to unnecessary deaths among those injured on the front lines, while also making it harder to safely move fresh soldiers into battle. Politico reports that the Pentagon is hoping to change this by including new Bradley fighting vehicles in the next tranche, alongside Humvees and M113 armored personnel carriers. And then there are the long-range missiles. As part of its package, the House included a non-binding resolution directing the president to authorize sending long-range ATACMS missiles to Kyiv, something Biden has so far resisted. That resistance comes from a sensible place. The US doesn't stockpile many ATACMS, and they feature heavily in American war plans should conflict erupt with Russia or China. On the other hand, ATACMS would give Ukraine a perhaps transformative advantage, putting all of Crimea in reach of Ukrainian missiles. And this is important because the peninsula is currently used by Russia as a key rear area for supporting its troops. Start raining missiles down on Kremlin assets in Crimea, and supplying frontline soldiers suddenly becomes a lot harder. To be clear, on the day of writing, it's still not certain what will and won't be in the next aid package. All the stuff we've outlined so far are either common sense things like artillery or things that have been leaked to the press like armored fighting vehicles. Long-range missiles may or may not be part of the package. We'll know in a week or two when the Pentagon signs off on the first shipments. Overall, though, the new aid is a massive win for Ukraine, likely the best news Kyiv has gotten in the whole of 2024. While no one thinks a silver bullet will be included, it's clear that the potential is there to at least stop the Ukrainian army from collapsing in the next few months. At least, we hope so, because this new splurge of American aid couldn't solve all of Ukraine's problems even if Biden donated every single Patriot battery and ATACMS missile in Pentagon stocks. That's because some of Ukraine's worst problems aren't due to the House dragging its feet or Europe failing to get its defense industrial base onto a war footing. In fact, one of the biggest issues can be laid right at the door of President Volodymyr Zelensky. And that issue is manpower. With a population over 3 times that of Ukraine, Russia has always held a huge potential manpower advantage over its victim. We use the word potential there because it's not at all clear the Kremlin can truly tap it. The partial mobilization of fall 2022 is one of the few moments in the entire war that Putin's popularity plunged in Russia, and Moscow is unlikely to order another if it can help it. That means Ukraine has, at certain times in the conflict, actually fielded a larger army than Russia. It could even be doing so now had the government agreed to former Commander Valery Zaluzhny's request last autumn to mobilize another 500,000 men. Instead, Ukraine's leaders did exactly what the House of Representatives did with the supplemental. They dithered and delayed, only voting through the unpopular legislation when it became clear they had no choice. As a result, Ukraine is now facing a manpower shortage on the front. In parts of the east, Russian troops outnumber Kyiv's forces 7-1, and because Moscow is able to add another 30,000 soldiers to its front line each month, it can currently absorb massive losses. To be blunt, this is terrible for Ukraine. While a new mobilization law will now come into force in May, the gap between calling up a man and placing him at the front could be up to 3 months, including time for basic training. This is why Konrad Mazika, director of the Rokhin military consultancy, expects things to keep getting worse for Kyiv deep into the summer. In his words, the most important source of Ukrainian weakness is the lack of manpower. It doesn't matter how many weapons the Americans now ship. If Ukraine has no soldiers available to use them, they won't hold Russia back. It'll only be in later summer or autumn that we'll start to see large numbers of fresh troops arrive at the front. Combined with US military aid, Konrad Mazika thinks that this may be enough for the situation to improve. But it may only improve for so long. For all the Ukraine bill passed both the House and the Senate with significant bipartisan majorities, no one really believes that a similar bill will pass again in the future. Maybe a smaller one, but perhaps not even that. And it's here, at last, that we can loop back around to our question from earlier. If this is probably the last significant slice of Ukraine funding from the US, what's it all for? What does Washington hope to achieve besides prolonging the conflict? And the answer is simple. In an ideal world, it buys Europe time to finally get its collective shit together. Had Europe moved its defense industries onto a war footing back in 2022 when analysts were warning the bloc to do so, Ukraine wouldn't be in this predicament right now. Although Kyiv would still be reliant on America for high-tech weaponry and things like Patriot interceptors, the artillery shortage would have been solved long ago. But Europe didn't do that. Through some frustrating combination of inertia and belief that the war would end soon anyway, most of the continent refused to kick its defense industries into high gear. When the bloc finally did start moving in the summer of 2023, things took longer to get rolling than anyone expected. It's only now that contracts have been completed, new arms factories are swinging into operation, and defense budgets are rising to meet the existential threat. Thanks to this slowness, Europe today simply isn't capable of arming Ukraine. The gamble Washington is taking with this $61 billion is that given 6 to 12 months to catch up, that might all change. Already we're seeing attitudes start to shift. On Monday, the UK announced its biggest donation of weapons to Ukraine yet, including, to quote The Guardian's coverage, 400 vehicles, more than 1,600 missiles, 4 million rounds of ammunition, 60 boats, as well as an additional $500 million in military funding. Germany, meanwhile, has turned from laggard on Ukraine into the nation leading a push to source new Patriot batteries and air defense interceptors. My adopted home of the Czech Republic is spearheading an initiative to buy over 1 million artillery shells, and the list goes on. According to Franz-Stefan Gady, the new aid package also gives Europe some temporary breathing space to ramp up air artillery ammo production and launches. We should see a noticeable increase in EU industrial output in late fall to winter. In other words, the most defining battle of the coming months may take place not on the rolling plains of the Donbass, but in the factories of Europe, an industrial battle to plug the gaps that could be left by a future American aid cutoff and ensure that Ukraine will always have the tools it needs to keep the Kremlin at bay. From a purely economic perspective, this should be easy to do. The West, even minus America, has a combined economy that absolutely dwarfs that of Russia. In addition, Europe is home to some of the best weapons producers on the planet, like Rheinmetall. To quote The Economist one final time, "The Russian economy is so much smaller that even when Mr. Putin's war takes precedence over everything else, it cannot outcompete the free world in the long run." The trouble is, we shouldn't only be looking at things from a purely economic perspective. There's also the question of political will. Since spring of 2022, it's been clear that a Russian victory in Ukraine would represent an existential threat to Europe, that Putin is interested in conquering territory in the Baltic states and in Poland that would put him on a collision course with NATO. In a sane world, this realization would have been followed by the continent moving onto a war footing. Had Europe mobilized its defense industrial base at the same time Putin mobilized Russia's, the conflict would probably be over by now. That Europe didn't do this should be a stain on the legacy of leaders like Olaf Scholz. More worrying, though, is the idea that European governments might look at the breathing space that this American aid has brought them, give a sigh of relief, and plunge their heads right back into the sand. If that happens, if Europe fails to significantly increase its military-industrial capacity by Christmas, then this latest package will be for nothing. All Mike Johnson's change of heart will have done is postpone the inevitable. Now, hopefully, that isn't the case. Hopefully, the new influx of weapons and ammunition will allow Ukraine to hold the lines while it mobilizes more troops. Hopefully, Europe will use this extra time to build up stockpiles that can keep Ukraine's howitzers fed with shells through 2025. If that's the case, then Saturday's vote could come to be seen as a turning point, a moment as significant for the Ukraine war as 1941 was for World War II. As Professor of War Studies at King's College London, Michael Clark told the BBC last weekend, "This is the 1941 moment. There was nothing but a defeat through 1940, 1941. The balance shifted for the Allies during 1941, but the effect wasn't felt until the autumn of 1942, the Battle of Alamein. The Ukrainians have got to stay in the war until the tide turns." The war itself may ride on for several more years, but when it's finally over, it may be this week just gone that historians look back on and judge as the moment that secured one side's eventual victory.